One more step for peace? That's what my guest asks in light of the recently minted Israel UAE Bahrain Accord. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me for this conversation is JES Scholar in Residence and Jefferson Board of Trustees member Dr. Ghosheh, who is a foreign policy expert on the Middle East and has held numerous presentations at the JES in the past. A bit more about Dr. Ghosheh. He holds a doctoral degree, a PhD in economic development from SUNY Buffalo, and has been a professor of Middle Eastern Studies, Cultural and Economic Geography at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania since 1989. He has graduate degrees in international relations, Middle Eastern studies, international trade, and comparative economic development. A native of Jerusalem, Dr. Ghosheh has lived in 8 countries, traveled to nearly 60, and has taught in Japan, China, Russia, Italy, and Morocco. He's authored a book chapters on Russia and the Middle East, and 60-plus articles on the Middle East, Asia, and Japan. He was awarded a Fulbright to conduct research in Malaysia and Singapore, and was selected as Pennsylvania Geographer of the Year and Edinburgh University's Educator of the Year. And as I mentioned, he serves on the Board of Trustees and is a scholar in residence with us. Now, with much fanfare, the Trump administration hosted leaders from Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain at the White House to sign an historic peace agreement called the Abraham Accords. President Trump insists that 6 to 9 other Arab Muslim countries will normalize relations and sign peace agreements with Israel before the November elections, coming up soon, November 3rd. What is the significance of this agreement? Does it advance the cause of peace in the region, or will it result in more polarization and conflict in this highly unstable region? That's what Dr. Ghosheh will help us examine here in this conversation. We're also going to discuss the predecessors of this peace accord, get an understanding of the historical agreements and disputes of nations involved, hear about the people and places featured, what it helps teach us about the complexity of foreign policy, and of course, what lies ahead. Since this conversation is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we are going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. If you are listening to or watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us a question and we'll get those along to Dr. Ghosheh as best as we can. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Ghosheh, thank you for joining me for this discussion.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So, I know a lot of times we say the best place to begin happens to be at the beginning. So I think to help us understand what this means for the Middle East and what this means today is really to look back and to look at the maximum extent of the Ottoman Empire. And that takes us back to the 1400s. And then we look at the collapse of the region, the empire after that. And so I know we're fast forwarding a little bit through colonization and how we shape the region. But I think it's important because what's happening today isn't simply happening because of yesterday. History has a long tail here. So can you take us back to the beginning, take us to the Ottoman Empire, if we're using that as a starting point for today's conversation?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Let me start by saying that Arabs and Jews, the children of Abraham, have been living, coexisting together for thousands of years. See if I can share the screen with you here. And then we can go into this. So the children of Abraham, Arabs and Jews, cousins, have been living in the region for thousands of years and living for the most part in peace. We had different empires that dominated the region for a long time. The Arab Islamic Empire was one of the largest empires in the region, dominated most of the Middle East, West Asia, and North Africa. The last empire to control the region was the Turkish Ottoman Empire.
So, Dr. Ghosheh, I know you mentioned you were going to pull up a presentation. At least I'm not seeing it just yet. So, if you wouldn't mind sharing the screen, that would be great if we can take a look at that. If you're planning to do that, I know folks at home would enjoy an opportunity to see the region you're talking about. So, if you
Yes.
can get there, fantastic. If you can't, I can work to pull that up on my end.
Yeah, I thought I'm sharing the screen. Let me see. It shows me sharing the screen. I'm not sure if okay, let's see.
There
Can
we
you
go.
see it? Okay.
It just clicked over, and we are now seeing your PowerPoint. Thank you, sir.
Okay, like I said, the Abraham Accord is not new. Arabs and Jews, both descendants of Abraham, have lived in peace for thousands of years for the most part. And we had different empires dominate the region. One of the largest was the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which controlled the region until the end of World War I. So we can see they dominated the populated areas of the Persian Gulf, of the Red Sea, of North Africa, of the Mediterranean region. But that ended with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. World War I meant that European powers, mostly French and British, took control of these Ottoman possessions. And that's where we have some of the conflict. The Treaty of Paris divided the region into possessions directly controlled by the French or the British. And the Holy Land, Palestine, was given to the British as a mandate. A mandate is simply temporary supervision until the locals can get their act together. The problem started because at the same time that the British were supposed to supervise this mandate, they had issued the Balfour Declaration, indicating that the British government looks with favor at the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The wording is very important, a Jewish homeland in Palestine. At the same time, they also vowed to protect the rights of the native population, who happen to be Muslim, Christians, and Jews. Again, we've had all three groups living there for centuries. The founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, famously said, Israel is in the Middle East, but not of the Middle East. While the Turks controlled the region, they did not allow much Jewish migration to the region, even though European Jews have sought that for a long time. The Turks did not want to change the composition of the population. So it's only when the British controlled this territory that we had mass Jewish migration, mostly from Europe to Palestine.
And I think that that's an important note, that Israel is in the Middle East, but not of the Middle East.
Again, these are the words of the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. So Israel is, of course, in the heart of the Middle East, really in the middle of the Middle East.
So, Dr. Ghosheh, did Israelites support his view of Israel? What was he representing them, or was this just the way he saw it?
Well, again, Israel now has attracted migrants, immigrants from throughout the world, from over 100 different countries. So he's basically referring to the fact that while Israel is in the Middle East, the population did not originate in the Middle East. The culture that these people bring in from France, from Argentina, from Russia, from Ukraine, from the United States is different from the culture that we find in neighboring countries. Israel is a much more modern country, much richer country, much more developed country than her neighbors.
And so I think this moves us along into looking at a two-state solution in the area, but we've been here before as well, and so looking at trying to make sense of Israel as one country in the Middle East, but not of the Middle East. It makes sense of the two-state solutions in terms of what we're looking at then, history, and how we're looking at it now, because we've been here before.
Yes, well, the British only controlled that territory for about 30 plus years. But during that time, again, with Jewish migration from Europe, Jews were being persecuted in Europe, and certainly that accelerated in the 1930s and 40s. but the native population did not want any Jewish migration. The Jews wanted larger Jewish migration. So by the 1920s, we have conflict, friction between the two groups. So the British decided maybe we have promised the Jews a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but not in all of Palestine. So we can create a Jewish state, and we can create an Arab state for the Muslims and Christians, and a Jewish state for the Jews. So they established a royal commission in the 1930s. The Peel Commission decided on a division. 80% of the land would be for Palestine, an Arab state, and 20% would be for Israel, the Jewish state. But that was 1939, on the eve of World War II, and that was never implemented. And we know because of World War II and what happened in Europe, millions of Jews were killed, many more were persecuted. So we had larger migration out of Europe. And following the end of World War II, the United Nations, which was mostly comprised of European countries, voted overwhelmingly to partition Palestine, divided into two states, an Arab and a Jewish state. So again, a two-state solution, but in this case, instead of 80-20, it's like 40-45 to 55-57.
And so I can't help but want to go back to the subtitle of your presentation here today. One more step for peace in the Middle East, and one more step toward peace suggests we've had a long journey toward it. So this is a region that we've seen conflicts, a history of war, and so. Give us a little bit of the history of Israel and some of the conflicts, but particularly following World War II. And there you've got it on the screen there. We see a number of conflicts between then and now.
Yes. So again, given that the United Nations has voted to divide Palestine into two countries, as I guess Friedman indicates in his book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, and as Jimmy Carter refers to this, the twice promised land, we see that at that time, the Arabs felt that the whole land should be theirs, and Jewish immigrants from Europe should not establish a country on their territory. The Jews accepted the plan, and the Arabs rejected it. The Jews, although much smaller in number, were much better organized, and we had the War of Independence. So Israel was created following the 1948 war, and it did not have 55% of the land. It actually was created on 78% of the land.
And why was that of 78% of the land? How did they determine that? What was the decision-making process behind that?
It was basically the result of the outcome of the war. Israel managed to control 78% of the land. So when we look at how we got to the borders we have today, this was basically the outcome of the war. So when we look at, this is the United Nations Division Plan on the left, following the 1948 War of Independence. Israel controlled more territories than it was allocated by the United Nations Plan. The only remaining territories were the West Bank of the River Jordan, and the tiny Gaza Strip. So in 1948, the Arabs decided these territories are too small to build a country in, to establish a state on. So Jordan took over the West Bank, and Egypt took over the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian state was never established.
And clearly that didn't hold, as we again see updates to that in 1967. We talked about the conflict in the region, and we went through, and that's what we're seeing on the screen right now, from 48 all the way up until today. We're continuing to see conflicts, but with conflict does come the opportunity to build peace in the region. So we have seen many chapters or treaties for peace in the Middle East. So
Yeah.
After we've gone through the conflicts, let's take a look at the peace and what that has looked like before. And if I can telegraph a question, I suppose the end question after we walk through these that I keep thinking of each time is, why doesn't it work? Why did each of these fail and move us to where we are today?
Actually, they didn't all fail. Some of them were limited. So let's start with President Carter and the Camp David Accords. Israel, following the 1967 war, occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula and the Syrian Golan Heights. So President Carter wanted to establish this, I guess, new concept that we call land for peace. Israel will give back the land it occupied in 1967, and in exchange, Israel will get peace. Israel was not willing to give up all of the occupied territories at the time. They negotiated with Egypt and agreed to basically give back all of Egyptian territory. The Sinai Peninsula is maybe 2-3 times larger than Israel itself. They gave it all back in exchange for a peace treaty with Egypt. They also signed a peace treaty with Jordan. And again, the small pockets of Jordanian territories that they occupied, they gave back, and they have a peace treaty with Jordan. So again, limited goals that were accomplished. But in both cases, we have what we call cold peace. Yes, they are not in conflict with one another anymore, but they don't have normalized relations.
And so is that what we hang the definition on? Because I think that many more people are familiar with the term Cold War when we hear that, but I don't think we often think of cold peace. What does cold peace mean? Does it just mean that we're not at each other's throats, we're not disputing each other?
What it means is we are no longer fighting, the absence of conflict, but we're not normal neighbors. We don't have the exchange of population or trade or tourism on large scale. We're not in conflict. And in some cases, we have security cooperation. There is security cooperation between Egypt and Israel and between Israel and Jordan. But it all depends on who's controlling the government. In some cases, more cooperation, in some cases, less cooperation. So President Carter in 1978 wanted to deal with all of these issues, wanted all of the land returned in exchange for peace, but the Israeli prime minister at that time wanted to take this one step at a time. He felt he could not concede all of these territories back, and he felt that if you took Egypt out of the Arab side, then Israel will be secure, because the Syrians on their own, the Jordanians on their own, or collectively would not threaten Israel unless Egypt was on their side, was their ally.
So from the United States perspective, what would you say was the greatest accomplishment of the Carter administration in the Camp David Accords? And what would you say was the either most frustrating or the shortcoming or even failure of the Carter administration at the Camp David Accords?
I wouldn't call it a failure. I think President Carter tried his best to resolve all the issues, but you can only do this if the two sides are willing to negotiate. And at that time, Israel and many Israelis were opposed to giving the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt for security reasons. But eventually, again, the Israeli approach was, let's take it one step at a time. We'll sign a peace treaty with individual countries. And President Carter pushed very hard to end the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights and of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But at that time, the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, will not budge. So Carter took what he could do, and he felt that this was the first step, and he established a precedent: land for peace. Israel gives back the land, and in exchange it will get peace.
And so let's fast forward to 2000. We see we're back at Camp David. Give us, for those who need a refresher course on your list there, Camp David 2000. What are we covering in 2000?
Well, in 2000 and during the waning days of the Clinton administration, Clinton came very close. Some would say they came within few hundred feet of resolving the issue. And the sticky, I guess, point here was, could Israel allow the Arabs to control the holy sites, the Muslim sites, the Christian sites? So this is especially, I guess, controversial because we have one holy site that is holy to Muslims and to Jews. The site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock is also the site where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and where Jews believe their old temple that was destroyed by the Romans existed. So who controls that territory? Who controls the Temple Mount on top? Who controls the, I guess, underneath area of the Temple Mount? And how do they share control of the holy city, especially the old city, where they have the holiest sites for Christians, for Jews, and for Muslims?
And in addition to the holy sites being a point of contention in trying to bring peace to the region, you have it on your slide right here that we're looking at water issues as well. You know, just
Water issues are
access to
crucial,
water.
yes.
So could you speak to that in terms of the interest of the players at hand here in this region, jockeying for access to the water, you know, based on their placement?
Yes, actually, water issues is especially important in the Golan Heights. Some Israeli leaders have actually been willing to give back almost all of the Golan Heights back to Syria. The only exception is they wanted to control the shore area of the lake so that they can have access to the water. So water issues are crucial. Much of the water that falls on the mountainous area in the West Bank ends up being used by Israel. So how much of the Jordan River water is given to Jordan, to Israel, to the Palestinians? Who gets most of the water? The population that lives in the area where the water falls, or the population where the water ends? So this water issue is crucial because the Middle East as a whole, most of the Middle East, maybe with the exception of Turkey, has a severe shortage of water. And water desalination might work if you have the money, if you're a rich country like Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't work if you're a poor country like Jordan or the Palestinian territories.
And I want to get to Saudi Arabia and I want to get to Iran in a minute, but I want to go back to one of the slides you had up because I think that that's one of the questions we're grappling with today is a big question. Will President Donald Trump succeed where others have failed? He's gotten people around the table and says there's more to come. And we'll talk about the more to come toward the end of the program, who that 6 to 9 might be and what next steps are. But taking a look at what Donald Trump's doing right now, will he succeed where others have failed?
Well, again, President Trump touts this as the deal of the century, but you can only have a deal if both sides agree to it. And we're only talking to one side. We're only talking to our allies, Israel. We're not even involving the Palestinians in the decision making. So when we look at peace in the Middle East, what President Trump has proposed is basically the right-wing Israeli government agenda for dictating the terms of peace in the region. So Israel, and maybe not all Israelis, but certainly the government of Israel is happy with the proposals by the Trump administration and by Kushner. But the Palestinians have not even been talking to us. They have even refused to receive the Secretary of State on his last visit to the region.
So I was going to ask you for a pulse check, to check the temperature of the relationship between the United States and Palestine. Are they willing to come to the table? Is the Trump administration going to welcome to the table, possibly use force to get to the table? What does the future look like there?
Well, what we have done so far is we have cut aid to the Palestinians as a way to pressure them to come to the table. But they have refused to come to the table because they felt that this deal of the century doesn't offer them much. What they want is a Palestinian homeland, a Palestinian state in most, if not all of the West Bank and in Gaza. That's what they have been, I guess, striving for since the 1993 Oslo Accords that Israel and the Palestinians signed, again, with heavy American intervention. President Bush and it's called the Oslo Accord because the Norwegians had backdoor negotiations between the two groups. And at that time, they agreed to this. Unfortunately, what led to not implementation of this accord is that the Prime Minister of Israel, who was willing to make peace with the Palestinians, was assassinated by right-wing Israelis who were opposed to the peace. So we took one step forward, and by the year 2000, like I said, we were within a few hundred feet. The issue was just the old city of Jerusalem, which is only 2 square miles, and the holy sites in the old city, and who controls these holy sites. That was the sticking issue.
And so when the prime minister was assassinated by the right wing faction, was that a majority feeling in the country at that time? What was it not? Was it just a small portion of those there? For those of us less familiar, what was going on in the time there?
At that time, actually, things were so much better than they are now. A solid majority on both Israeli side and Palestinian side was willing to compromise and felt that peace was within reach within few years. So when President Bush came up with his roadmap for peace, again, he was trying to build on what others have started. So they were talking about, oh, if we deal with the issue of Iraq, we can have peace in the region, because Iraq was seen as a potential threat to Israel. So whether we're talking about the Clinton administration, whether we're talking about Bush administration, at that time, peace was seen as not just possible, but accepted and desired by the majority on both sides. Things have changed dramatically since then.
Well, and I think one of the changes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that it makes this complicated or complex in the region is the role Iran and Saudi Arabia play, particularly through proxy wars. Are we seeing that being a stress to these conversations as well?
Certainly, what has changed also, I mean, in addition to the role Iran might play, and many think that Iran is playing a negative role in this regard, in supporting radical groups in the region or revolutionary groups in the region. The other big issue is that we see a definite change in the region, especially in Israel, towards the right. So the current Israeli government, probably for the last 10, 11, 12 years, has not moved towards negotiations or towards implementation of the agreed upon agreement, peace agreement with the Palestinians. So we see polarization on both sides. But the Netanyahu government, and Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel, is not interested in a two-state solution.
Is there anything that could march them closer to a two-state solution, or is this a deal breaker for that administration?
I think it's still possible, and I think just like things change from a solid majority wanting peace and supporting peace efforts to maybe a majority not supporting it, I think we can go back and establish maybe some confidence building measures between the two groups and find a resolution. Ironically, every prime minister in Israel that comes close to signing a peace deal and ending the conflict ends up either out of office, in jail, or assassinated. So we've seen that in the 1990s, and we see that in 2008.
So I've got to ask again, is that just the voice of extremists in the country, or is that a louder chorus within the region that we see that they don't want to march toward that?
I think, and this is I guess the point I was trying to make, is that not only do we have some governments moving to the right, but we also see that other issues are coming to the fore. It used to be that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the core issue in the Middle East. Not anymore. For many people, they look at Iran as the main issue, the main threat. At one time, Iraq was the main issue and the main threat. The Arab Spring became the main issue for a couple of years. So we see the Palestinian issue put on the back burner.
And so in mentioning Iran there, and we talked about land before, they're a big player in the region, just starting with the size of the country. They occupy a significant portion compared to some of their neighbors in terms of the just pure real estate they take up. But then too, we fold in the idea that we have the nuclear agreement, and the United States is in, the United States is out. But let's look at Iran and Saudi Arabia. What's the most important things that we can take away from their involvement in the Middle East in this part of this conversation?
Well, let's start with going back to history, because things have changed dramatically in the last 41 years. Iran in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was a very close ally of the United States. Iran was a very close ally of Saudi Arabia. Iran was a close ally of Israel and provided Israel with all the oil that it needed. That's Iran under the Shah. So the collapse of the Shah regime and the Islamic Revolution in Iran meant we have a new Iran that is dominated by religious leaders, Shia religious leaders, the Islamic Republic of Iran, that is determined to export its revolution. And exporting revolution means you need to topple these monarchies on the other side of the Gulf. So if we look at the slide here, we can see the division in the region between Sunni and Shia. This wasn't an important division in the past. Increasingly, we see the region that's highly polarized. We have Sunni monarchies on one side, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Kuwait, Oman. And on the other side, we have the Shia majority countries like Iran and Iraq. Syria is also dominated by the Shia minority. And Lebanon has a very sizable Shia population. Some would say even a Shia majority. So Iran has emerged not just as an Islamic regime in the region, but a revolutionary Islamic regime that is determined to overthrow and change the monarchies in the region across the Gulf.
And earlier you just mentioned the idea of Iraq being one of the biggest players in this discussion, and I can't help but think from the U.S. perspective, our invasion of Iraq has altered that trajectory and changed that course. Yeah. Can you speak about the impact of that and how that shifts the dynamics in the Middle East?
In the 1970s, when we had the Iranian Revolution, we had Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And Iraq was, I guess you would say, a counterbalance to Iran. So the United States, we sided with Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, a bloody war that lasted 8 years and killed 1 million people. We supported the aggressor. The aggressor at that time was Iraq. But we wanted to contain Iran, so we provided weapons, intelligence, food, supplies to the Iraqis. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis all supported Iraq in the war against Iran. So Iran was isolated. Iran's only ally at that time in the region was Syria, an alliance that continues until today. So we have that emergence of this Shia crescent. By invading Iraq and taking out Saddam Hussein, we ended the Sunni domination of Iraq. And now we handed the lever of power to the Shia who are closely tied to Iran. So we can see this was from 2003. Many of us warned that the invasion of Iraq will be counterproductive. The invasion of Iraq would basically advance Iran's interest. And we have done actually two things in the region that helped free Iran's hand. We took out the Sunni regime in Afghanistan, the Taliban, and we took out the Sunni regime in Iraq, Saddam Hussein.
And as we look at Iran growing in this process, we see the Obama administration vocal and at the table helping to broker the Iran nuclear deal and push that through. And then we see the repudiation of that with the Trump administration. So if we're doing a pulse check there in terms of Iran's impact and in terms of the United States' relationship to Iran and the Middle East through the brokering of the Iran nuclear deal and then the stepping away of the Iran nuclear deal, what does this all mean for us?
Well, I mean, many thought that we've had this almost 4 decades of hostility between the United States and Iran following the overthrow of the Shah, the takeover, the election of Hassan Rouhani in Iran, a moderate, somebody who wanted to reach out to the West, who wanted to improve relations with the United States, normalize relations with Europe, was seen as a good first step. So yes, we had actually negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran, and this nuclear deal was intended to limit Iran's nuclear capability and ambition. And in exchange, we will lift the sanctions on Iran. The deal was welcomed by both Iranians, by Americans, by Europeans, Russians, Chinese. So we had the 6 major powers welcoming and negotiating this deal. And you can see from the slide that this basically what President Obama said, this will block every route that Iran has to nuclear weapons.
Without stripping them fully of their nuclear capabilities, too. They would still have capabilities, but this would fully strip the path to making a nuclear bomb.
And again, they would be subject to 24-hour surveillance by international experts. International inspectors could go in at any time, inspect any facility. The Iranians will reduce their enrichment of uranium to weapons-grade uranium by 98%. So they will have less enriched material to make weapons, even if they wanted to do it. So again, most of the experts believe that this was a win-win situation. Iran will get its frozen assets released. Iran will no longer be under sanctions, and Iran would no longer be able to make or try to make nuclear weapons.
You moved right into the slide I was going to ask you about. So if this is a win-win and we're celebrating on both sides, why does the Trump administration see this as something they want to walk back?
Well, again, the only country in the region that maybe some few countries in the region were opposed to it. Saudi Arabia didn't like it because they don't want the United States to have better relations with Iran. They still view Iran as a threat. Israel views Iran as a threat. The current Likud government, Likud-dominated government of Israel viewed Iran as a threat. So some were not satisfied with 15-year ban on developing a nuclear weapon or reduction of enrichment of uranium. Some wanted to go after Iran's missile capability, after Iran's activities in the region, like support for the government in Syria, support for Shia militias in Iraq, support for Shia militias in Yemen, support for Hamas in Gaza. So what they want is not just nuclear, they wanted an agreement that can deal with other issues. Eliminate Iran's ballistic missile program, stop its influence in the region, support for different groups in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen. So what they wanted is much more. It would not be a nuclear agreement, it would be agreement basically to demilitarize Iran. And Iran would never go for that.
I was going to ask, it doesn't seem like that's something that's going to bring them to the table. And so, are we seeing a viable path toward that doesn't involve some sort of force or measures of force?
Again, the United States, as soon as President Trump was elected, he decided to withdraw the United States from the agreement, an agreement that the Europeans have signed, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. We're the only one that withdrew from the agreement.
And earlier you mentioned, that they're is a closer relationship, it seems at least, and I say that lightly, because I think it's evident, a closer relationship with the Trump administration to Saudi Arabia and leadership there. This isn't the first time, and I got to see your slide deck in advance. You have a great slide of American presidents, coupled with, getting pretty cozy with leaders in the region in the Middle East. So this isn't new. But is this something we have to be concerned about in terms of the Trump administration's warming toward and leaning toward Saudi Arabia away from other countries that we've worked with in the past?
Well, we've always, I mean, since the establishment of Saudi Arabia, we've had close relationship with Saudi Arabia. And again, many in the region and around the world are concerned, especially given how Saudi Arabia is being run today, the last few years, given the corruption and the oppression of the royal family, especially since Mohammed bin Salman has been taking over the levers of power. So yes, certainly President Carter celebrated with the Shah. President Bush was very close ally of the king of Saudi Arabia at that time, Abdullah. We embraced Hosni Mubarak, who was the dictator of Egypt. We embraced Gaddafi, who was the dictator of Libya. If we look at who our close allies in the region today, they're not the models of democracy. Unfortunately, we went into the Middle East and we went into Iraq because we wanted to bring democracy to Iraq. Many people are concerned that instead of changing them, they are changing us. We're becoming more like them than them becoming less like us.
Well, and I can't help but laugh at that as well, and the impact of that, and I think this hits on one of the questions we've gotten from the audience that's been passed over to me, and it looks at, every time the U.S. is going into the Middle East, it seems as if we have good or well-crafted intentions to provide stability to the region, but it seems as if maybe more often than not, are destabilizing the region. From an expert point of view, how destabilizing has U.S. involvement been? And I think that leads right into the next question I want to ask you, which is what's happening right now with the Abraham Accords, and how does that add to the conversation? Are we one step closer to peace? So are we destabilizing the region more than we stabilize it by U.S. presence in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, it depends on what actions you take. Many would think that the invasion of Iraq was certainly highly destabilizing. Before the invasion of Iraq, the region was more stable. Yes, we had another dictator in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was hated by the majority of Iraqis. But the region was more stable at that time. And certainly, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed in the civil war that ensued following the collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime. And again, we went in there maybe with the best of intention to democratize Iraq, to spread democracy in the region. Do we have more democracy in the region today? The clear answer is no. Are the Iraqis better off today than they were under Saddam Hussein? It depends on which faction you come from. Certainly they hated him, but did they want to see a civil war, an ethnic cleansing, a sectarian cleansing in Iraq? That's what we got. So can we be a stabilizing force? Absolutely. It depends on which action we take.
So let's look at the action on September 15th, 2020, at the White House. Take us there. How does this advance that conversation? Are we one step closer to peace? Who's involved? What does this mean? And is this, as President Donald Trump puts it, the deal of the century?
Well, this is different from the deal of the century, but the Trump administration hasn't had much foreign policy success. And the Israeli prime minister is under siege because of his corruption charges and because of the way they handled the coronavirus. They have one of the highest infection rates in the world. So both leaders wanted to show some success at the international stage. The UAE and Israel have had low-level contacts for decades. Israeli athletes have competed in Dubai. They've had business interaction between the two countries. The two countries were never at war. So you don't sign peace with somebody you're not at war with. So is it a good step? Certainly, it would be nice to normalize relations with your neighbors. But if we look at the motivation behind this, the Emiratis wanted somebody to step in and fill the vacuum. So the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East. This has started under the Bush administration, it continued under the Obama administration, and it's being accelerated now under the Trump administration. So the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, all of them are concerned that if we withdraw, we will leave a vacuum that Iran or Turkey or Russia would fill. So they wanted to have a replacement for us, a counterbalance to Iran.
Is this a sizable counterbalance? Does this continue to balance scales, or does it not?
It does. I mean, when you look at this, here, this is, I guess, the adage in the Middle East: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We see an alliance of convenience. We have the same common enemy. Israel sees Iran as an enemy, as a potential threat. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as the greatest threat. So does UAE. They have a border dispute. They have some disputed islands, and they worry that Iran is still determined to export the revolution and topple these regimes. So what we see is that Israel will fill the vacuum that the United States will create by withdrawing from the Gulf and from the Middle East.
That's a conversation decades in the making now. Do you think it's feasible that the U.S. is going to withdraw? Because that was a challenge to the Obama administration. They promised to get troops out of the Middle East and found it much more challenging than they anticipated it to be, something that President Obama was not able to deliver upon. And we saw the same thing with President Trump and his administration, that he campaigned on the promise to get more troops out of the Middle East, and he's finding it to be much more challenging than anticipated. Does this move the needle in a significant way of getting U.S. troops home without, as you just mentioned, finding the balance? It looks like we have that, but is it possible that this is what gets us to withdrawing the most amount of U.S. troops that we've seen in the past 2 decades?
Well, it depends on what happens in the election, but regardless of who wins, I think we have seen a change of focus in the United States. We're much more focused now on East Asia and China than we are on the Middle East. We're less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than we have been in maybe 5 decades. We produce more oil, we produce more natural gas, and we see, again, if we have the Green New Deal or something similar to that, we'll have less need for oil and fossil fuels. So do I think that this trend of continuing to reduce U.S. footprint and presence in the region will continue? Absolutely. Doesn't matter who's elected. And that's what worries many people in the region. Our allies in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Bahrain, again, all of these feel threatened by Iran for different reasons. Iran is a revolutionary regime that wants to overthrow all these monarchies. Bahrainis worry that Iran will help their Shia majority revolt against the Sunni royal family. Saudi Arabia worries that the Iranian will support the Shia minority to become maybe an independent country. And by taking over this small strip of land in Saudi Arabia will lose all the oil. So if the Hassa region became Hassastan, the country of Hassa, Saudi Arabia will have nothing but desert sand.
That's not something that Saudi Arabia is going to accept or
No.
or want to work toward. And so another audience question, I think this brings us right to where we want to be in our conclusion, is that President Trump said there's a range, 6 to 9 other countries that may be wanting to get to the table. For those who are skeptical that there are other people eager to get to the table, for those who are optimistic that others are coming to the table, who do we think is next? Are we getting signals from the administration? Who's going to make sense of who makes sense to come to the table that we have a real shot at talking to right now?
Well, there are a few candidates certainly that could potentially be next. Oman is probably the most likely candidate, in my opinion. They've had low-level contacts and exchange visits between Omani leaders and Israeli leaders. Morocco already had well-established channels to Israel and has worked with Israeli leadership over the decades. But I think the United States is trying to buy off Sudan with an offer of $1 billion in aid and removal from the country that supports terrorism. The biggest prize that everybody wanted was Saudi Arabia, but within Saudi Arabia, we have two schools of thought. If it were up to Mohammed bin Salman, MBS wants to normalize relations with Israel today, if he could, but his father opposes that. His father still wants to stick to the Saudi peace plan, and he thinks that until and unless Israel withdraws from the occupied Palestinian territories, you cannot have normal relations with Israel. So there are many countries, Tunisia possible, but I doubt that we will have 6 or 9. We might have 1 or 2 more between now and the elections. And no significant countries. I don't think it's going to be Saudi Arabia or Indonesia.
And so, Dr. Ghosheh, final question here as we wrap up this conversation. That was the question that you posed in your subtitle, one more step toward peace. Is this a true step toward peace? And if it is, if we can say, yes, this moves the region toward peace, how significant of a step is this based on the history we covered earlier in this conversation?
I think it certainly is a positive step to have normal relation between Israel and some of her neighbors, even though neighbors that are farther away that Israel was not in direct conflict with. But to have real meaningful steps toward peace, the Israeli government has to go back to the negotiating table and implement the agreement that it signed. The agreement basically said, and that's going back to 1993, Israel will have peace in exchange for land. The Oslo Accords said Israel will withdraw from the occupied territories in stages within 5 years. I know my math is not great, but 93 plus 5 doesn't equal 2020. So they haven't implemented those agreements. So it will be great to have normal relations with all of her neighbors, but if Israel wants to build an alliance and be fully integrated into the region, they will need to do more than just sign a trade agreement with Bahrain or a cold peace with the UAE, countries that they've never were in conflict with.
Dr. Ghosheh, I just checked the back of my envelope math. It turns out we're both right. 5 years is not 2020 from 1993. But thank you so much for covering the history that you covered, starting back in the 1400s and getting us all the way up to today. I hope that we can invite you back again as Middle East discussions continue to evolve. As we draw closer to November, if something happens, when something happens, we'll have a chance to talk about that. So thank you very much for taking a look at the Israel-UAE Bahrain Accord. One more step toward peace in the Middle East with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you to all of you watching along at home. Thank you so much for tuning into this Jefferson program, whether you're watching live or you're watching a later broadcast of this. For more information about upcoming discussions, as well as on-demand videos of past discussions, as well as a wide range of publications, please visit the Jefferson Educational Society's website at jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.